The weight of my violin case pulled at my shoulder as I navigated through the opulent ballroom of the Drake Hotel, my black dress a stark contrast against the sea of glittering gowns and tailored tuxedos. The annual Chicago Elite Charity Gala was in full swing, with crystal chandeliers casting dancing shadows across marble floors that probably cost more than my entire year's rent. I wasn't supposed to be here as a guest. I was the hired entertainment, scheduled to perform a 30-minute set during dinner. My fingers traced the familiar curve of my violin case's handle, a nervous habit I'd developed over years of performances. Tonight felt different, though. There was an electricity in the air that had nothing to do with the orchestra tuning their instruments in the corner. Wealthy socialites mingled with business moguls, their laughter echoing off the vaulted ceilings, while servers in crisp white uniforms glided between them with champagne flutes. I found my designated spot near the grand piano, a small raised platform that would give me visibility over the crowd without making me the center of attention. Perfect. The last thing I wanted was to draw unnecessary notice from Chicago's elite. My father, Judge Robert Morrison, had always warned me about getting too close to the powerful families that dominated this city's social scene. Some of those smiles hide very sharp teeth, Juliet. He'd told me just last week when I'd mentioned tonight's performance. Play your music, collect your fee, and come straight home. As I unpacked my violin, the familiar ritual calmed my nerves. The Stradivarius, a family heirloom passed down from my grandmother, gleamed under the lights. Its rich, honey-colored wood had witnessed decades of performances, but tonight it seemed to tremble in my hands with anticipation. The ballroom's acoustics were incredible. I tested a few notes, letting the sound carry across the space, and noticed several heads turn in my direction. Good. That meant they'd actually listen when I began my formal performance. I'd chosen a selection of classical pieces that would complement the evening's sophisticated atmosphere without overwhelming the conversation. A server approached with a glass of champagne, which I politely declined. I never drank before a performance. It dulled the precision I needed for complex passages. Besides, I wasn't here to socialize. This was work, and I needed to remain professional. The crowd's energy shifted suddenly, conversations quieting as someone entered through the main ballroom doors. I glanced up from tuning my violin to see what had captured everyone's attention. A man in an impeccably tailored black tuxedo moved through the crowd with the kind of confidence that commanded respect, or fear. He was tall, probably in his early 30s, with dark hair slicked back and piercing eyes that seemed to catalog every person in the room. People stepped aside for him without being asked. Women's gazes lingered as he passed, while men straightened their spines and offered respectful nods. This wasn't just wealth walking through the room. This was power. Raw, undiluted power that made my instincts prickle with warning. I forced myself to look away and focus on my preparations. Whatever drama was unfolding in Chicago's social hierarchy wasn't my concern. I was here to play violin, nothing more. Ladies and gentlemen, the event coordinator's voice crackled through the sound system. Please welcome our evening's musical entertainment, Miss Juliet Morrison. The spotlight found me as polite applause rippled through the crowd. I positioned my violin beneath my chin, raised my bow, and let the first haunting notes of Pachelbel's canon fill the ballroom. The familiar melody wrapped around me like a protective cocoon, transporting me away from the watchful eyes and into the pure space where only music existed. I moved through my repertoire with practiced ease, box air on the G-string, followed by a passionate rendition of Vivaldi's Winter from the Four Seasons. The crowd had returned to their conversations, but I could feel their appreciation in the way the room's energy shifted with each piece. This was what I lived for, the moment when music transcended mere entertainment and became something transcendent. As I transitioned into the final piece, Mozart's Violin Sonata No. 21, I became aware of a particular intensity in the room's atmosphere. It felt like being watched by a predator. My eyes swept the crowd during a brief instrumental pause and locked onto the same dark-haired man from earlier. He stood near the bar, a crystal tumbler in his hand, his attention fixed entirely on me. The scrutiny should have made me nervous, but instead it sparked something defiant in my chest. I'd performed for audiences far more intimidating than one well-dressed man at a charity gala. I lifted my chin slightly and poured every ounce of passion into the final movement, letting the violin sing with a clarity that made several conversations pause mid-sentence. When the last note faded, the applause was genuinely enthusiastic. I took a modest bow and began packing my instrument, grateful that my obligation was complete. The fee from tonight's performance would cover my rent for the next 2 months and leave enough for groceries. Not glamorous, but sufficient. That was extraordinary. The voice came from directly behind me, smooth and cultured with just a hint of an accent I couldn't place. I turned to find the dark-haired man standing closer than I'd expected, his presence somehow more overwhelming up close. This near, I could see that his eyes were an unusual shade of green, like sea glass, and there was a small scar running along his left temple that suggested his life hadn't been entirely sheltered. "Thank you," I replied politely, continuing to pack my violin. "I'm glad you enjoyed it." "James Salvatore," he said, extending a hand. The name meant nothing to me, but something in his tone suggested it should. "And you are far too talented to be playing background music at charity events." I accepted his handshake briefly, noting the expensive watch on his wrist and the way his suit had been tailored to emphasize his broad shoulders. "Juliet Morrison, and I'm perfectly content with my career choices, thank you." His smile widened at my response, as if my slight coolness amused rather than offended him. "I'm sure you are. Tell me, Miss Morrison, do you dance as beautifully as you play?" The question caught me off guard. I glanced around the ballroom, where couples had indeed begun moving onto the dance floor, as the orchestra struck up a waltz. Several women nearby were watching our conversation with poorly concealed interest and what looked like envy. "I prefer to observe rather than participate," I said carefully. Something about James Salvatore set off warning bells in my mind. Maybe it was the way people kept glancing in our direction, or how the very air seemed to change when he moved through it. "Pity," he murmured, stepping slightly closer. "I was hoping you might honor me with a dance." The request was phrased politely, but there was an underlying expectation in his voice, as if he wasn't accustomed to being refused. The women within earshot were staring openly now, and I caught several whispered conversations that seemed to center on shock that James Salvatore was speaking to the hired entertainment. "I appreciate the invitation," I said, securing my violin case's latches with more force than necessary. "But I don't dance with strangers. If you'll excuse me, I have another engagement this evening." The lie came easily. My only engagement was with a cup of tea and a book in my apartment. But something about this man made me want to establish distance immediately. His expression flickered. Surprise, followed by what might have been amusement or annoyance. "Of course," he said smoothly. "Perhaps another time." I nodded politely and gathered my things, acutely aware that our entire exchange had been observed by what felt like half the ballroom. As I walked toward the exit, I could feel his gaze following me like a physical weight between my shoulder blades. The cool October air outside the hotel was a relief after the stifling atmosphere of the ballroom. I pulled my coat tighter and hailed a taxi, eager to put distance between myself and whatever undercurrents I'd stumbled into tonight. Some instinct told me that refusing James Salvatore's invitation had been the right choice, even if I couldn't articulate exactly why. As the taxi pulled away from the curb, I caught a glimpse of a figure in the hotel's entrance. James Salvatore stood silhouetted against the warm light spilling from the ballroom, his hands in his pockets, watching my departure with an expression I couldn't read. Something cold settled in my stomach as our eyes met through the taxi's rear window. I had the distinct feeling that this wouldn't be the last time our paths crossed, and that thought terrified me more than I cared to admit. I woke to the sound of my apartment building's front door buzzing incessantly. Groggily, I checked my phone, 6:47 a.m. Who could possibly be visiting this early on a Sunday morning? The buzzing continued, sharp and demanding, echoing through my small one-bedroom apartment in Lincoln Park. Wrapping my robe around me, I padded to the intercom by my front door. "Hello? Miss Morrison?" The voice was unfamiliar, professional. "Delivery for you." I frowned. I hadn't ordered anything, and deliveries didn't typically arrive on Sunday mornings. "What kind of delivery?" "Floral arrangement, very large. Should I bring it up?" Still confused, but not wanting to leave someone standing in the cold October morning, I buzzed them up. Through my peephole, I watched a delivery man struggle up the stairs with what appeared to be an enormous bouquet of white roses, at least 3 dozen of them, arranged in an elaborate crystal vase that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. "These are for Juliet Morrison?" he confirmed when I opened the door. "Yes, but I think there's been a mistake." "No mistake, ma'am. Sign here, please." Or, the bouquet dominated my small living room once he'd positioned it on my coffee table. The roses were perfect, their petals just beginning to open, and their fragrance filled the entire apartment. Tucked among the stems was a small card in heavy cream stock. "Thank you for the performance last night. Your talent deserves a more appreciative audience. J.S." My hands trembled slightly as I read the card. James Salvatore had somehow discovered where I lived and sent flowers that probably cost more than I made in a week. The gesture should have been flattering, but instead it felt invasive. How had he gotten my address? I was careful about my privacy, especially given my father's position as a federal judge. I set the card aside and tried to push down the unease creeping up my spine. Perhaps it was just an extravagant thank you from someone who genuinely appreciated classical music. Wealthy people sometimes made grand gestures without thinking about how they might be perceived. But as I made coffee and tried to settle into my normal Sunday routine, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Twice, I caught myself checking the windows of my third-floor apartment, scanning the street below for anything unusual. Nothing seemed out of place, just the typical Lincoln Park morning with joggers and dog walkers moving along the tree-lined sidewalks. My phone rang as I was reading the Sunday Tribune, making me jump and spill coffee on the arts section. "Juliet, you sound tense." My father's voice carried his usual note of concern. Judge Robert Morrison had an uncanny ability to detect when something was troubling me. "Just tired from last night's performance," I said, not wanting to worry him with what was probably nothing more than an overly enthusiastic admirer. "How did the gala go?" "I hope the city's elite treated you with appropriate respect." I hesitated, thinking of James Salvatore's intense green eyes and the way the entire ballroom had seemed to revolve around his presence. "It was fine. Standard charity event. The acoustics were excellent." "Good, good. You know how I worry about you performing at those sorts of gatherings. Some of the families who attend." He trailed off, but I knew what he meant. Chicago's wealthiest circles often intersected with less savory elements of the city's power structure. "Dad, do you know anyone named James Salvatore?" The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "Where did you hear that name?" "He was at the gala last night. We spoke briefly after my performance." Another pause. "Juliet, I want you to listen to me very carefully. James Salvatore is not someone you want to have any association with. If he contacts you again, you call me immediately. Do you understand?" My father's tone sent ice through my veins. In all my 25 years, I'd rarely heard him speak with such grave seriousness. "Dad, what aren't you telling me? Just promise me you'll be careful. And if anything unusual happens, anything at all, you call me right away." After we hung up, I stared at the white roses dominating my living room with new eyes. My father's reaction confirmed what my instincts had been screaming since last night. James Salvatore was dangerous in ways I couldn't yet comprehend. I spent the rest of the morning researching his name online, but found surprisingly little concrete information. There were mentions in society pages, photographs from various charity events and business functions, but nothing that explained the fear I'd heard in my father's voice. James Salvatore appeared to be a successful businessman with interests in real estate and hospitality, nothing more. Yet the lack of detailed information was telling in itself. In the age of social media and digital footprints, most people left extensive trails. The fact that James Salvatore's online presence was so carefully curated suggested significant resources and motivation to control his public image. Around noon, my phone chimed with a text from an unknown number. I hope you enjoyed the roses. Perhaps we could discuss your next performance over dinner tonight. James. My hands shook as I read the message. He had my phone number now, too. The walls of my apartment suddenly felt thin and vulnerable, as if his presence could penetrate them through sheer will. I didn't respond to the text, hoping that silence would convey disinterest. Instead, I tried to lose myself in practice, pulling out my violin and working through some challenging Paganini exercises that required total concentration. The familiar discipline of technical work usually calmed my mind, but today, even the music couldn't quite dispel the growing sense of unease. The afternoon passed quietly enough that I began to convince myself I was overreacting. Perhaps James Salvatore was simply a wealthy man unaccustomed to being refused, and my father's reaction was just protective paranoia. I made a simple dinner and settled in with a book, determined to treat this as a normal Sunday evening. At 8 o'clock, my building's front door buzzer rang again. This time, I didn't answer it. The buzzing continued for nearly 5 minutes before stopping, leaving my apartment in tense silence. I crept to my window and peered down at the street, but saw nothing unusual, just empty sidewalks under the golden glow of streetlights. My phone buzzed with another text. I know you're home, Juliet. We need to talk. The use of my first name, the certainty in his words, made my heart race. I double-checked that my apartment door was locked and considered calling the police. But what would I tell them? A man had sent me flowers and asked me to dinner? That hardly constituted a crime. 20 minutes later, a soft knock came at my door. Not the building's front entrance, but my actual apartment door. Someone had gotten inside the building. Miss Morrison? The voice was different from this morning's delivery man, deeper with a slight accent. Mr. Salvatore would like a word. I backed away from the door, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floors. Through the peephole, I could see a man in a dark suit, his hands clasped in front of him in a stance that suggested military or security training. I'm not available, I called through the door, proud that my voice remained steady. He's waiting in the car downstairs. Just 5 minutes of your time. Please leave or I'll call the police. There was a pause, then the sound of footsteps retreating down the hallway. I waited by the door for several minutes before cautiously checking the peephole again. The hallway was empty, but when I looked out my window, I could see a black sedan parked directly across from my building. The windows were tinted, but I had no doubt who was inside. I called my father. Juliet, what's wrong? James Salvatore is outside my building. He sent someone to my door asking me to come down and talk to him. The curse my father let slip was one I'd never heard from him before. Are you safe? Is your door locked? Yes. But Dad, how did he find my apartment? How did he get my phone number? Men like Salvatore have resources most people can't imagine. Listen to me carefully. You're going to pack a bag and come stay at the house for a few days. I can't just run away because some man sent me flowers and asked me to dinner. This isn't about flowers, Juliet. James Salvatore is connected to the Torino crime family. He's dangerous in ways you can't possibly understand. The words hit me like a physical blow. Crime family. The pieces suddenly clicked into place. The way people had reacted to him at the gala, the deference and fear, the careful distance others had maintained. "I'll pack now," I whispered. "No, don't leave the apartment tonight. It's not safe to move in the dark. First thing in the morning, I'll send someone to escort you." After my father hung up, I sat in my darkened living room, afraid to turn on too many lights and reveal my presence to whoever might be watching from the street below. The white roses seemed to mock me from the coffee table, their beauty now sinister in the shadows. Every sound from the building made me jump. Footsteps in the hallway, doors closing, the ancient heating system's groans and sighs. I dozed fitfully in my chair, unwilling to go to my bedroom where I'd feel more vulnerable. Just before dawn, I heard the soft rumble of a car engine starting. When I cautiously checked the window, the black sedan was gone, but tucked under my door was a single white rose with another note in that same heavy cream stock. "You can't hide forever, beautiful. We will dance eventually." J.S. The safe house my father had arranged turned out to be a modest cabin in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, about 2 hours north of Chicago. Detective Sarah Chen, a family friend who worked closely with federal law enforcement, had driven me there early Monday morning while my father pulled strings to ensure the location remained confidential. "This is temporary," Detective Chen assured me as we pulled up the gravel drive. "Just until we can figure out exactly what Salvatore wants and how to handle it legally." The cabin was rustic but comfortable, surrounded by tall pines that would provide cover from prying eyes. It had been used before to house witnesses and had basic security measures in place. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe without looking over my shoulder. But isolation brought its own challenges. With nothing but my violin and my thoughts for company, I found myself obsessing over every detail of my encounter with James Salvatore. Had I somehow encouraged his attention? Was there something I'd said or done that made him believe I was interested? On Wednesday evening, as I was practicing near the cabin's large front window, I noticed headlights turning up the drive. My heart hammered against my ribs until I recognized Detective Chen's unmarked sedan. She wasn't alone. A second car followed behind her. "We need to talk," Chen said when I opened the door. "There's been a development." The man who emerged from the second car was someone I didn't recognize. Tall, silver-haired, wearing the kind of expensive overcoat that suggested significant authority. His pale blue eyes assessed me with sharp intelligence as Chen made introductions. "Juliet Morrison, this is Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Brennan. He's heading up a federal investigation that your situation has become relevant to." Brennan's handshake was firm, but brief. "Miss Morrison, I understand you've been having some unwanted attention from James Salvatore." We settled around the cabin's small dining table, and Brennan opened a briefcase filled with photographs and documents. The first image he placed in front of me was a surveillance photo of James Salvatore, entering what appeared to be an upscale restaurant. "For the past 18 months, we've been building a RICO case against the Torino crime family," Brennan explained. "James Salvatore is Vincent Torino's right-hand man and presumed heir to the organization. He's also one of the most dangerous men in Chicago." He spread out more photographs. James at various business meetings, entering buildings, speaking with men whose faces had been circled in red ink. He oversees their money laundering operations through a network of legitimate businesses. Restaurants, nightclubs, real estate development. All very profitable, all very illegal. My mouth felt dry as I studied the images. This was the man who had asked me to dance, who had sent roses to my apartment. Why is he interested in me? "That's what we're trying to figure out," Chen said. "Your father thinks it might be connected to his position on the federal bench. Judge Morrison has been assigned to several cases involving organized crime figures over the past few years." Brennan leaned forward, his expression grave. "There's something else you need to know. 3 days ago, Vincent Torino was shot outside his restaurant in Little Italy. He's in intensive care, and there's significant doubt about whether he'll survive." The implications hit me immediately. Which means James Salvatore is about to become much more powerful. Exactly. And historically, men in his position consolidate power through strategic alliances. Sometimes that involves marriage into other influential families. Brennan's gaze was direct and unflinching. Your father is one of the most respected federal judges in the Northern District of Illinois. A connection to his family would provide Salvatore with significant legitimacy and protection. I stood abruptly, needing to pace. You're saying he might be targeting me as some sort of political marriage arrangement? It's one theory, Chen said gently. The other possibility is that he's genuinely attracted to you and isn't accustomed to being refused. Men like Salvatore don't hear no very often. Either way, Brennan continued, you're in a precarious position. We've intercepted communications suggesting that Salvatore has been asking questions about your schedule, your habits, your security arrangements. The cabin's cozy warmth suddenly felt stifling. I moved to the window, staring out at the dark forest beyond. What do you want from me? Your cooperation, Brennan said simply. We're close to having enough evidence to bring down the entire Torino organization, but we need more documentation of their financial operations. If Salvatore continues pursuing you, it might provide an opportunity to get someone inside his inner circle. I turned to face them, incredulous. You want me to spy on him? We want you to be our eyes and ears if the situation develops naturally, Chen clarified. You wouldn't be asked to actively seek out information or put yourself in danger. But if he continues his pursuit, any intelligence you could provide might help us protect other innocent people from his organization's influence. The weight of their request settled on my shoulders like a lead blanket. And if I refuse? Then you'll need to remain in protective custody indefinitely, Brennan said. Because men like James Salvatore don't typically lose interest in something they want. He'll keep escalating until he gets what he's after. I thought of my small apartment in Lincoln Park, my students who depended on me for violin lessons, the life I'd built, note by careful note. All of it suspended because I'd refused one dance at a charity gala. I need time to think. Of course, Brennan said, gathering his photographs. But don't take too long. Intelligence suggests Salvatore is growing impatient with your absence. He's been making inquiries through channels that suggest he's preparing to take more direct action. After they left, I sat alone in the cabin's silence, my violin cradled in my lap but unplayed. The strings reflected the dim lamplight, like silver threads in a web. Beautiful, delicate, and increasingly tangled. That night, I dreamed of dancing in an empty ballroom, while dark eyes watched from the shadows. When I woke, sunlight was streaming through the windows, and I'd made my decision. I called Detective Chen first thing in the morning. I'll do it, I said without preamble, but I have conditions. Name them. If this goes wrong, if I get in too deep, you pull me out immediately. No arguments, no delays. Agreed. And my father doesn't know the specific details. He'll worry himself sick if he knows I'm deliberately engaging with Salvatore. There was a pause. That might not be possible, Juliet. He'll need to be briefed on security protocols. Then you figure out how to manage it. Those are my terms. Another pause, then. All right. We'll work something out. When do we start? Today. We're bringing you back to Chicago this afternoon. And Juliet, thank you for this. You might be saving more lives than you realize. As I packed my few belongings, I wondered if I was making a terrible mistake. James Salvatore was clearly a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, and I was about to walk directly into his web. But perhaps it was time to stop running and start fighting back. I'd spent my entire life believing that talent and hard work were enough to build a safe, independent existence. Now I was learning that sometimes safety required taking calculated risks. The drive back to Chicago passed in a blur of autumn landscape and racing thoughts. By evening, I was back in my apartment, surrounded by the familiar walls that no longer felt like protection. The white roses had wilted in my absence, their petals scattered across the coffee table like fallen snow. I threw them away and waited for James Salvatore to make his next move. I didn't have to wait long. The knock came at exactly 8 o'clock Thursday evening, soft but insistent. I'd been expecting it since Detective Chen had returned me to my apartment that afternoon, but my heart still hammered against my ribs as I approached the door. Through the peephole, I saw the same man who had come to my door Sunday night, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing an expensive suit that couldn't quite disguise the bulge of a shoulder holster. But this time, he wasn't alone. James Salvatore stood beside him, his hands clasped behind his back, his posture relaxed but alert. "Miss Morrison?" The bodyguard's voice was professionally polite. "Mr. Salvatore would appreciate a few minutes of your time." I took a steadying breath, remembering Chen's coaching from earlier. Act reluctant but not terrified. Show curiosity about why he's interested in you. Don't agree to anything immediately. "I've made it clear I'm not interested in socializing, Mr. Salvatore," I called through the door. "I understand your caution," came his reply, his voice carrying easily through the thin wood. "But we have mutual interest to discuss. 5 minutes, that's all I ask." "What mutual interest could we possibly have?" "Your safety, for one." "May I come in? These hallways have excellent acoustics, and some conversations are better held privately." The implied threat was subtle, but unmistakable. I could continue this exchange where neighbors might overhear, or I could invite him inside where we could speak candidly. Neither option felt safe, but Detective Chen had emphasized the importance of seeming to cooperate. I unlocked the door and opened it, staying partially hidden behind it as they entered. James Salvatore moved through my modest living space with the same predatory grace I'd observed at the gala, his eyes cataloging every detail. His bodyguard remained by the door, a silent sentinel. "Charming," Salvatore said, examining the framed photographs on my mantelpiece. "You come from an accomplished family. Your father's reputation precedes him." "Is that what this is about? My father?" He turned to face me, and I was struck again by the intensity of his green eyes. Up close, in the intimate setting of my apartment, his presence was even more overwhelming. "Partially. Your father is a man of integrity in a city where integrity is rare. That makes him valuable. And dangerous to men like you." His mouth curved in what might have been amusement. "Direct. I appreciate that quality." He gestured toward my couch. "May I sit? Standing makes me feel like I'm intimidating you, which isn't my intention." I remained standing, keeping distance between us. "What do you want, Mr. Salvatore?" "James, please. And what I want is surprisingly simple." He settled onto my couch as if he belonged there, his movements fluid and controlled. "I want to get to know you better." "Because I refuse to dance with you?" "Because you're the first person in years who's treated me like a human being rather than a title." His expression grew unexpectedly serious. "Do you know what it's like to have every interaction calculated? Every conversation filtered through fear or ambition? You spoke to me that night as if I were simply another guest at the gala." I studied his face, looking for deception, but finding what appeared to be genuine emotion. "And that's worth pursuing me to my home? Disrupting my life?" I'm afraid I've gotten rusty at normal courtship. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze never leaving mine. "In my world, when you want something, you take direct action to obtain it." "I'm not something to be obtained." "No," he agreed. "You're someone to be won. There's a significant difference." The distinction should have been reassuring, but something in his tone suggested that his methods of winning might be just as invasive as simple taking. "And if I'm not interested in being won?" "Then I would need to understand why. What would it take to change your mind?" The question hung between us, loaded with implications. Chen had prepared me for this, the moment when I'd need to show enough interest to keep him engaged, without committing to anything specific. I don't date men I don't know, I said carefully. And what I know about you comes mostly from whispered warnings. Ask me anything. I'll answer honestly. Are you a criminal? He didn't flinch at the direct question. I operate businesses that exist in gray areas of the law. Some would consider that criminal. Do you hurt people? This time there was a pause, and I saw something flicker across his features. When necessary, to protect what's mine. The clinical way he said it sent ice through my veins. Have you killed anyone? That's not a question I can answer safely, for either of us. Which was an answer in itself. I wrapped my arms around myself, suddenly cold despite the apartment's warmth. Why would I want to be involved with someone like that? Because I can offer you protection, security, opportunities that don't exist in your current life. He gestured around my modest apartment. You're talented enough to be performing at Carnegie Hall, yet you're giving violin lessons to children and playing background music at charity events. That's not fulfilling your potential. Maybe I like my simple life. Do you? Or have you simply convinced yourself that wanting more is dangerous? The question struck uncomfortably close to home. I had often wondered what my life might look like with better connections, more opportunities to showcase my abilities. But I'd also learned early that my father's position made it wise to keep a low profile. I don't need rescuing, I said. Everyone needs something, he replied. The question is whether you're brave enough to admit what that is. Before I could respond, his phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and his expression hardened instantly. Excuse me? He answered the call, speaking in rapid Italian that I couldn't follow. When he hung up, the carefully controlled man who had been courting me was gone, replaced by someone harder and infinitely more dangerous. I have to leave. We'll continue this conversation soon. Maybe we won't. He paused at my door, looking back with an expression that was almost fond. You're remarkably stubborn, Juliet. In my experience, that's usually a sign of someone worth the effort it takes to break through their defenses. After they left, I sank onto my couch, my hands trembling slightly. The wire Chen had given me had recorded every word, but I felt contaminated by the interaction. James Salvatore's presence lingered in my apartment like expensive cologne, overwhelming and impossible to ignore. My phone rang within minutes. How did it go? Chen's voice was carefully neutral. He's not what I expected, I admitted. More intelligent, more human than I anticipated. That's what makes him dangerous. Evil rarely announces itself with horns and a pitchfork. Usually it comes wrapped in charm and rationality. He admitted to operating in gray areas legally, and when I asked if he'd killed anyone, he said it wasn't safe to answer. Good. That's the kind of admission that could be useful in court. How did you leave things? He said we'd continue the conversation soon. I got the impression that wasn't really optional. There was a pause. Juliet, I need you to understand something. We've received intelligence that Vincent Torino died this afternoon. That makes James Salvatore the head of one of Chicago's most powerful crime families as of tonight. The implications hit me like a physical blow, which means he's about to become much more dangerous and much more valuable to our investigation. We need to know how he's planning to restructure the organization, who his new lieutenants will be, how he's going to handle territorial disputes with rival families. You're asking me to get close to a man who just inherited an empire built on violence. I'm asking you to help us prevent that empire from growing larger. Salvatore is young, ambitious, and intelligent. If we don't stop him now, he'll be running this city within 5 years. After Chen hung up, I stood alone in my apartment, acutely aware that my life had just shifted irrevocably. The man who had asked me to dance was now one of the most powerful criminals in Chicago, and I was the only person positioned to provide law enforcement with intelligence about his plans. Outside my window, the familiar sounds of Lincoln Park, Traffic, distant music, the hum of ordinary life, continued unchanged. But for me, normalcy had become a luxury I could no longer afford. I had chosen to walk into James Salvatore's web. Now I had to survive long enough to help the FBI cut it apart. The flowers arrived Friday morning. Not roses this time, but white orchids arranged in a sleek black vase with a card that simply read, "To New Beginnings." James. I was still staring at the arrangement when my building's front door buzzer rang. Through the intercom, a woman's voice announced herself as Maria Santos, personal assistant to Mr. Salvatore. When I opened my apartment door, I found an impeccably dressed woman in her 40s with steel gray hair and intelligent dark eyes. She carried a garment bag and wore the kind of understated jewelry that whispered rather than shouted wealth. "Miss Morrison," she said with a slight accent that might have been Spanish or Italian, "Mr. Salvatore has requested that I deliver this and extend an invitation." She handed me an envelope made of heavy cream stock, the same kind that had accompanied the roses. Inside was an invitation written in elegant calligraphy. "The honor of your presence is requested for dinner tomorrow evening at Torino's restaurant, 7 o'clock. Address has been provided for your convenience." "I don't recall accepting any invitation," I said carefully. Maria's smile was polite, but didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Salvatore was confident you would reconsider, given recent circumstances. He mentioned that you might be curious about his new responsibilities." The phrasing was delicate, but the message was clear. Vincent Torino's death had changed everything, and James Salvatore wanted me to understand what that meant for both of us. "And if I decline?" "Then I will convey your regrets, and he will be disappointed." Maria's tone suggested that disappointing James Salvatore was not advisable. However, he specifically asked me to mention that the restaurant will be closed to other patrons tomorrow evening. It would be a private dinner, with enhanced security for your comfort. The garment bag she handed me was heavier than expected. When I unzipped it after Maria left, I found a dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Midnight blue silk that would complement my dark hair and pale skin perfectly. The designer label meant nothing to me, but the craftsmanship was extraordinary. I called Detective Chen immediately. "This could be exactly what we need," she said, after I described the invitation. "A private dinner means he's ready to talk business. We'll wire you with our best equipment and position surveillance outside the restaurant." "Chen, this feels like it's escalating too quickly. Yesterday he was asking for 5 minutes of conversation. Now he's arranging private dinners and sending me designer dresses." Vincent Torino's death accelerated his timeline. He needs to consolidate power quickly, and apparently that includes securing whatever alliance he thinks you represent. That evening, I tried on the dress and was disturbed by how perfectly it fit. James Salvatore had somehow obtained my exact measurements, which suggested a level of surveillance that made my skin crawl. But when I looked in the mirror, I had to admit the result was stunning. The silk draped elegantly, transforming me from a struggling violin teacher into someone who belonged in his world. Saturday evening arrived with unseasonable warmth for October in Chicago. The wire Chen had fitted beneath my dress was sophisticated enough to be nearly undetectable, but I was hyper-aware of its presence as the black sedan arrived precisely at 6:30. The same bodyguard from Thursday evening held the door open for me. "Good evening, Miss Morrison. Mr. Salvatore is looking forward to dinner." Torino's restaurant occupied a prime corner location in Little Italy, its Art Deco facade suggesting old-world elegance with modern sophistication. As we pulled up, I noticed the heavy security presence. Men in dark suits positioned at strategic points around the building, their earpieces glinting in the streetlight. James Salvatore was waiting inside the restaurant's entrance, and the sight of him took my breath away. He wore a charcoal suit that emphasized his broad shoulders and tall frame, his dark hair perfectly styled, his green eyes bright with anticipation. When he smiled at my approach, the expression transformed his usually serious face. "Juliet," he said, taking my hand and bringing it briefly to his lips. "You look extraordinary." The restaurant had been transformed for our dinner. Instead of the usual crowded dining room, only one table remained, positioned near the large windows overlooking the street, set with crystal and silver that caught the light from dozens of candles. The rest of the space had been cleared, creating an intimate dining room just for us. "You've gone to considerable trouble," I observed as he guided me to my chair. "Special occasions deserve special attention." He took the seat across from me, his movements fluid and controlled. "I thought you might appreciate privacy for our conversation." A server appeared with champagne, but I declined. "I don't drink much." Another admirable quality. James accepted a glass of what appeared to be expensive whiskey. Most people in my position are surrounded by individuals who tell them what they want to hear. Your honesty is refreshing. The first course arrived, some sort of delicate seafood preparation that probably required hours to prepare. I took a small bite, acutely aware that every word of our conversation was being recorded. "You mentioned new responsibilities," I said carefully. "I assume you're referring to Mr. Torino's death." His expression grew somber. "Vincent was like a father to me. His passing creates both opportunity and obligation." "What kind of obligation?" "To protect the people who depended on him, to maintain the stability he created, to honor his legacy while adapting to changing circumstances." James leaned forward slightly. "The business world is evolving, Juliet. Old methods aren't always effective for new challenges." "What kind of new challenges?" "Competition from younger, more aggressive organizations. Federal attention that requires more sophisticated legal strategies. The need for legitimacy in a society that's becoming less tolerant of traditional approaches." I was beginning to understand the subtext. James Salvatore was planning to modernize and legitimize the Torino organization, which would require connections to respectable society. Connections like a federal judge's daughter. "And you think I might be helpful with these challenges?" "I think you represent something I've been missing." His gaze was direct, intense. Respectability, intelligence, culture. The kind of partnership that could open doors previously closed to men in my position. Partnership implies equality. What you're describing sounds more like acquisition. His smile was slight but genuine. "You don't make this easy, do you?" "I don't make anything easy for men who think they can purchase what they want." "Good. If you were easily purchased, you wouldn't be worth the effort." He set down his glass, his expression growing serious. "Let me be completely honest with you, Juliet. My world is dangerous, complicated, and often unforgiving, but it's also powerful enough to protect the people I care about from any threat they might face. Including threats that come from your world, especially those threats." The second course arrived, but I'd lost my appetite. "What exactly are you offering me, James?" "Security, opportunity, the chance to use your talents on a stage worthy of them. Protection for you and your family from elements of this city that most people never even realize exist. And in exchange, your companionship, your intelligence, your presence at my side as I build something new from what Vincent left behind." The proposal was seductive in its scope. James Salvatore was offering me entry into a world of power and influence that most people could only imagine. But the price was my independence, my safety, and quite possibly my soul. "I need time to consider this." "Of course, but understand that time is a luxury we may not have much of." His expression darkened. "Vincent's death has created instability. Other organizations are already making moves to claim territory they think we can't defend. I need to demonstrate strength quickly. And having a federal judge's daughter on your arm would demonstrate that strength. Among other things, yes." Before I could respond, his phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and I saw his jaw tighten. "Excuse me for one moment." He stepped away from the table to take the call, speaking in low, urgent Italian. When he returned, the carefully controlled man who had been courting me was gone, replaced by someone harder and infinitely more dangerous. We need to leave. Now. What's happening? Someone firebombed one of my warehouses 20 minutes ago. This was meant to be a message, and I need to respond appropriately. As he helped me from my chair, I caught a glimpse of the man James Salvatore became when his empire was threatened. His movements were precise and economical. His voice carried absolute authority, and his eyes held a coldness that made me understand exactly why people feared him. "The car will take you home," he said as we reached the restaurant's entrance. "We'll continue this conversation soon." "James?" He paused, looking back at me with an expression that mixed regret with determination. "This is what my world looks like, Juliet. Beautiful moments interrupted by ugly realities. If you choose to be part of it, you need to understand that completely." As the sedan pulled away from the restaurant, I watched James Salvatore disappear into a black SUV surrounded by armed men. The contrast between the man who had brought my hand to his lips and the one who was now heading off to wage war was stark and unsettling. But it was also oddly magnetic. There was something intoxicating about witnessing such raw power, such absolute confidence in the face of danger. James Salvatore was offering me a life where I would never have to worry about rent or security, or whether my talents would be recognized. The question was whether I was brave enough, or foolish enough, to accept. The explosion came at 3 a.m, shattering my bedroom window and throwing me from sleep into terror. Car alarms shrieked throughout the neighborhood as I stumbled to the window, my bare feet crunching on broken glass. Across the street, where a black sedan had been parked for the past week, orange flames licked at the sky. My phone was ringing before I could fully process what had happened. "Juliet, are you hurt?" James Salvatore's voice was sharp with concern. "I'm fine, but..." "Stay away from the windows. I'm sending men to get you now." "James, what's happening?" "Someone sent me a message about getting too close to a federal judge's family. They're using you to threaten me." His tone carried barely controlled fury. "Pack a bag. You're not safe there anymore." Through my broken window, I could hear sirens approaching. Fire trucks, police, probably federal agents who would arrive once they identified the target. The careful dance I'd been performing between James and Detective Chen was about to become impossible to maintain. "I can't just disappear," I protested. "People will ask questions. People will ask more questions if you're dead." The brutal honesty in his voice silenced my objections. "5 minutes, Juliet. Bring whatever you can't live without." I threw clothes into a suitcase with shaking hands, my mind racing. The wire I'd worn to dinner was hidden in my dresser drawer, along with Chen's contact information and emergency protocols. I couldn't take any of it without risking exposure. As I was zipping my suitcase, my apartment door opened. I spun around to find not James's usual bodyguard, but a woman in her 30s with short auburn hair and predatory eyes. She moved through my apartment with professional efficiency, checking corners and exits. "I'm Elena," she said without preamble. "We need to go, now." "Where are you taking me?" "Somewhere safe." Elena's gaze catalogued my apartment with the same thoroughness James had shown. "Bring your violin. You'll want something familiar where we're going." The building's fire escape provided our exit route, avoiding the chaos of emergency responders gathering in front. Elena moved with military precision, her hand never far from the gun holstered beneath her jacket. We descended into the alley behind my building, where another black sedan waited with its engine running. The drive took us north out of the city, past suburbs and into rural Illinois. We traveled in silence for nearly an hour before turning onto a private road, marked only by a discreet security gate. The property beyond was extensive, rolling hills dotted with mature trees, a large main house visible in the distance, and enough open space to see anyone approaching long before they could pose a threat. "Welcome to Salvatore Estate," Elena said as the main house came into view. "This will be your home for the foreseeable future." The mansion was a study in understated elegance, stone and timber construction that suggested old money rather than nouveau riche ostentation. James Salvatore was waiting on the front steps, still dressed in the dark clothing he'd worn to deal with the warehouse bombing hours earlier. "Are you hurt?" he asked immediately, his hands framing my face as he examined me for injuries. "Just shaken." His touch was gentle despite the obvious tension in his posture. "James, you can't just kidnap me because someone threatened you." "I didn't kidnap you. I protected you from people who would have used you to get to me." His green eyes were fierce with conviction. "There's a difference." Elena disappeared with my suitcase, while James guided me into the mansion's foyer. The interior was as impressive as the exterior suggested: high ceilings, artwork that belonged in museums, and an atmosphere of quiet luxury that spoke of generations of wealth and power. "This is temporary," I said, more to convince myself than him. "That depends on you." He led me into a sitting room, dominated by a massive stone fireplace. "But it's also reality. The people who bombed that car tonight won't stop with property damage. They're testing my resolve, trying to find weaknesses they can exploit." "And I'm a weakness?" "You're someone I care about, which makes you a target." The admission seemed to surprise him as much as it did me. "I didn't anticipate that complication when I first approached you." Before I could respond, a door opened and an older man entered, silver-haired, impeccably dressed despite the early hour, with intelligent eyes that missed nothing. His resemblance to James was unmistakable. "Father," James said, rising, "this is Juliet Morrison." "Ah, the young lady who's been causing such upheaval." The older man's smile was polite, but assessing. "I'm Vincent Salvatore Sr. Welcome to our home." Vincent Sr. Not James's father, but Vincent Torino's father, which made him James's predecessor before Vincent Jr. took over. The family connections were more complex than I'd realized. "Mr. Salvatore," I managed, unsure of the appropriate protocol for greeting the patriarch of a crime family. "Please call me Vincent. We're going to be seeing quite a lot of each other." He settled into a leather armchair with the careful movements of someone managing old injuries. "James tells me you're a musician. I've always appreciated classical music. Perhaps you'll play for us sometime." The casual domesticity of the suggestion was surreal given the circumstances. But there was something in Vincent Sr.'s manner that suggested refusing him would be unwise. "I brought my violin," I said carefully. "Excellent." Vincent's approval seemed genuine. Music brings civilization to even the most complicated circumstances. Over the next hour, as dawn began to lighten the sky beyond the mansion's windows, I learned more about the world I'd stumbled into. The Salvatore family had operated in Chicago for 3 generations, building an empire that spanned legitimate businesses and less legal enterprises. James was being groomed to modernize the organization, bringing it into the 21st century with reduced federal exposure and increased profitability. "The old ways are dying," Vincent Sr. explained as Elena served coffee in delicate china cups. "Men like my son Vincent thought force was always the answer. James understands that true power comes from making yourself indispensable rather than feared." "And where do I fit into this modernization?" "You represent legitimacy," James said. "Connections to respectable society that can open doors previously closed to us. Your father's position, your education, your reputation, all valuable assets in the new landscape we're building. You're talking about me like I'm a business acquisition." "Never that." James leaned forward, his expression intense. "But I won't pretend your background isn't part of what makes you valuable to me. The question is, what I can offer that's valuable to you." Before I could answer, his phone buzzed with an urgent message. His expression darkened as he read it. "The warehouse bombing was just the beginning," he said grimly. "They've also hit 2 of our restaurants and tried to intimidate some of our legitimate business partners." "Who's they?" I asked. The Kozlov organization. Russian Bratva that's been trying to expand into our territory for months. James stood, his posture shifting into command mode. They think Vincent's death makes us vulnerable. Are you vulnerable? His smile was sharp and dangerous. They're about to discover exactly how mistaken that assumption is. As James left to coordinate his response, Vincent Sr. remained behind, studying me with those intelligent eyes. My advice, young lady, is to think very carefully about what you want your life to look like, he said quietly. James is offering you more than most people ever dream of having, but he's also offering you dangers most people never have to face. And if I choose to leave, then you'll leave with our gratitude and protection. Vincent's tone was sincere. But you should understand that leaving may not be as simple as it sounds. Knowledge of our affairs brings certain obligations. The implication was clear. I'd seen too much, learned too much to simply walk away and resume my old life. Whether I stayed as James's partner or left as someone who needed to be managed, my independence was already compromised. As I sat alone in the mansion's elegant sitting room, watching the sun rise over grounds that were both sanctuary and prison, I realized that my choice had already been made. Not by James or his family, but by the sequence of events that had begun with a simple refusal to dance. I was part of James Salvatore's world now, whether I'd chosen it or not. The only question remaining was whether I would embrace that reality or spend the rest of my life fighting it. When James returned hours later, his suit replaced by casual clothes but his eyes still sharp with the aftermath of violence, I had my answer ready. I'll stay, I said simply. But I have conditions. His smile was triumphant but controlled. Name them. I want to continue my music. Real performances, not just private entertainment. Done. I can arrange auditions with the Chicago Symphony within the month. I want some independence, a role in whatever you're building, not just decoration for your arm. You'll have as much responsibility as you can handle. And I want honesty between us. No more games, no more manipulation. If we're going to be partners, we're equals. James crossed the room to where I stood, his movements deliberate and predatory. When he reached me, his hands framed my face with the same gentleness he'd shown earlier. Partners, he agreed, in everything. When he kissed me, it tasted like danger and possibility in equal measure. I was surrendering more than my independence. I was choosing to build something new with a man who could destroy me as easily as protect me. But as his arms closed around me, and the morning light filled the mansion with warmth, I realized I'd never felt safer or more alive. James Salvatore had won more than my compliance. He'd won my heart.